it's hard to argue with success. And Russell, when I look at these squash plants here, why they're just nearly perfect. They're a little bit small. Of course, a lot of people get their started early, and you said you thought this was some old seed,
right? And
you just put it out. Well, you know, they're to the stage that they're putting on some small squash, and you've got a fair amount of them on there. I see a tinge of white, and you said that that was 7 dust that you put on to keep the squash bugs off and stuff like that. They're setting pretty good, but you were telling me some of your plants you've had a little bit of problem with them getting pollinated, that the blooms just fall off.
Cucumbers.
I've had a lot of calls on that this year with cucumbers, squash, okra, some tomatoes, and any time that the blooms just fall off, it's because the plant didn't get pollinated, because the flower didn't get pollinated. That can partially be from that real hot weather that we had, and the insects just weren't out. But for the most part, I think, you know, with our lack of bee population around, that little by little that's going to get to be more and more of a problem. So you really want to watch what you do put in the garden. And one thing, I mean, you've done, I think, a good job with your 7 dust here, but I caution people not to constantly put 7 dust in their gardens, because the bees come and get it, and it's real deadly on bees. And so what you've done here and the little bit that you've got is a good deal, I think. But those people that just dust them constantly every day, that's just what they do. They get them, go to their garden and put out some 7 dust. I think that's a mistake, from the fact that then they end up with a lot of other plants that don't get pollinated. And of course, bees aren't the only thing that pollinate stuff. Wasp and a lot of things pollinate the different things in the garden. So you know, bees aren't the only thing that we're interested in pollinating our garden, even though we really I don't like to be stung any more than anybody else does, but we kind of watch that. But this looks good. Of course, when you've got squash bugs, which you haven't had many on this, have you? I don't know if it's just the time of year. You know, squash bugs live and overwinter out in the pastures and in the leaves and stuff, and then as soon as squash gets ready in the spring, here they come. So you know, you've got to be ready to take care of them at the very start. Check underneath the leaves, because they'll come right into a garden as soon as the squash is up and starting to grow, and lay their eggs on the bottom side of the leaves, and boy, you just got a problem. One of the best things on squash is to lay a board, a shingle or a thin one by or something, on the ground, and come out of a morning and take that board off. And if you've got any squash bugs, they're going to be underneath that board, because they look for a place at night to shelter. So get into a spot like that. If you're checking your squash too, right between the stem and the ground is where they're most likely to be and hard to find. Of course, sometimes when they're eating you plumb up, you find them everywhere, but lots of times. But boy, it just, your squash looks good, and it's surprising that as little sunlight as you got here that they have, but you can't argue with success, and they seem to be doing pretty good. Well, Russell, a lot of these tomatoes are probably somewhat tall and spindly as tomatoes go because of the lack of sunlight. They probably are needing a little bit more nitrogen to grow a little bit more heftier. Only the soil test will show us whether or not they need a little bit of different pH or something like that, which is probably a pretty good possibility here. But one of the big things that I notice is that, in my opinion, in most of the deals, they're planted way too thick. Now, that has not been a problem here, because you know, they're kind of growing in shade and stuff too. Right. But if you were in an area where these really bushed out a bunch and everything, they would have such a big amount of leaves down close to the ground that there would be a lot of septoria and foliar diseases that would be on there. The wind couldn't blow through the tomatoes, so they would stay wet. Anytime you came out here and bumped something, there's a pretty good chance that the spores from the septoria would just be moving around and infecting other leaves. That's probably the #1 problem in gardens in Cherokee County, is the septoria on tomatoes. Yeah. And it'll overwinter in the soil, which that's another thing that you need to keep in mind. Since you're here for the 3rd year, that'll start to affect you. But it overwinters in the soil. When the temperatures get right, it'll affect the bottom leaves. Of course, that's usually sometime in mid-May, and when that happens, we're usually so wet and so humid and all that, that with every rain, it'll just kind of bounce up. And so I have people call it a blight, and there is something similar called a late blight, but it will just work its way up. And by this time of year, a lot of people will only have green leaves right in the very top of their tomatoes. And they can control that by spraying a fungicide and planting their tomatoes far enough apart that wind can get through them and it can dry out a little bit, because humid conditions and just the right temperature and the foliage staying wet all the time is what causes that. So, you know, that would be something that I would for sure do when you get your fertility a little bit changed. And of course, being in the shade, if these were big bushy tomatoes, would be that much more of a problem, because the stuff is just going to stay that much wetter that much longer into the day.
Okay.
Well, let's go to a commercial break and we'll look at some of this other stuff when we get back.